Chapter 1301. By the way, have we gotten anything back about Linda's accident? Maisie got to the point because she almost forgot about it. Nolan got up, walked to the desk, and took out a file. Linda's workplace, including the clients she had and her boss, all the information is in here. Maisie walked over, took the file, and flipped through it. Just as she suspected, the place she had been working at had an illegal backing. It was impossible that Linda didn't know about it. If she weren't a willing participant, she should have gone to see Maisie when she noticed something was off. Nolan sat on his leather seat. I've asked Tanner to check it out. Coincidentally, that loan company had dealings with his first love. Maisie paused before she continued going through the information. Illegal loans, forced naked loans, exploiting employees. How could a company like this not have been investigated? Nolan chuckled. No one did before this, but it's happening now. The loan company was surrounded by police cars, and the passers-by stood around to see what was going on. The police officers let out a group of people while police officers with guns stood by and watched. When Mr. Donovan was let out, he was still explaining, "Officer, I didn't do anything. The students willingly sent us their nudes in exchange for a loan. I didn't force. Get in." The police officer pushed him into the cruiser. After the company was locked up, the police officers drove the men away. In the interrogation room, Mr. Donovan was put in handcuffs and was questioned by the police officers under the bright light. When they asked about Linda, he was surprised and immediately said, "What happened to Linda?" She wanted to cancel her contract. There's a fee for breach of contract, but she hasn't paid that yet. Moreover, we give out loans, and it's not a crime. We don't kill people. The police officer slammed the table and looked serious. It's not a crime, but it's illegal. Forcing women to send nudes in exchange for a loan is a transaction. You even swindle, exploit employees, and threaten people. That's enough to send you to prison. Mr. Donovan's expression changed, and he sat up straight. "No, officer, you don't have evidence." The other police officer threw a stack of papers on the table. "Do you want to take a look at what we have?" Mr. Donovan opened the file, and his face turned pale, and he immediately stopped talking. Meanwhile, Maisie and Nolan were standing on the other side of the window and were watching what was happening. The police officer asked, "Have you seen Linda in the past 2 days?" "Why, yes." Cold sweat started pouring as Mr. Donovan asked, "Did something happen to her?" The police officers didn't answer. "Where did you see her, and what was she doing?" He answered, "At the building site on the outskirts. I asked to meet her there because we needed to talk about the penalty for breaching her contract." He didn't dare say she had been kidnapped and his people had beaten her up. The police officers stared at him and only spoke after a long pause. "She got into an accident that day and died at the building site." "Did you do it?" Mr. Donovan was stunned, then started yelling, "I didn't do it. After we talked, we dumped her there and left. I have people that can confirm she was still fine when we left." Chapter 1302. Maisie looked at Mr. Donovan's expressions, because one could tell a lie through that. Even though he looked very emotional and anxious, his eyes didn't avert. He was just explaining because he didn't want to suddenly be linked to a murder. The police officers left the interrogation room and looked at Nolan. "Mr. Goldman, I don't think they caused the accident." Nolan spoke to him for a bit, and then he brought Mr. Donovan out when Maisie suddenly walked forward. "Hold on." The police officer and Mr. Donovan both looked toward her. Maisie walked to him. "When you met Linda, what did she say to you?" Mr. Donovan paused, looked at the police officer, and then replied, "I asked her to pay the penalty as soon as possible, and she agreed." "Did you remove her SIM?" Maisie asked. He took a deep breath, almost out of patience. "Why would I do that? I didn't think she would have the guts to call the police on me." "That's all then." After Maisie said that, the police officer took him away. Nolan walked to her and held her hand. "Why did you ask?" Maisie looked around. Her SIM was intact before her accident but was later removed. Even if her phone was crushed, the card wouldn't just disappear unless. After Linda was killed, someone took her phone and removed it. As for why that was done, it was simple, to remove her call list. Mr. Donovan had said that Linda agreed to pay him, but even though Maisie rejected Linda when she asked for money previously, she probably would still contact her to borrow some money because she was desperate. However, since Linda had tried to drug her that morning, she hadn't called Maisie, and if Maisie had drunk the tea and died, Linda wouldn't be able to pay back any of the money she owed anyway. All that was enough to indicate that someone had promised to give Linda some money, and that was why she had tried to poison her. When Maisie snapped back, she held Nolan's hand. "By the way, I want to ask Quincy to get her call record." Nolan smiled. "All right." At a private rental zone. Cecile went to Linda's room along with the landlady, and once she opened the door and saw how messy it was, she couldn't help but feel disgusted. The landlady looked at the immaculately dressed Cecile and said, "This is Linda's room." "Are you really Linda's friend? I've never seen you before." Cecile took out a few dollars and stuffed them into her hand. "I'm here to help her collect her things. You can leave me here." The landlady held the money and smiled. "All right, do whatever you wish. Just hang the keys at my door when you leave." After she left, Cecile walked into the room and covered her mouth and nose in disgust. She's Maisie's cousin, but they live so differently. TSK, that's why she hated Maisie. She walked to the desk and went through everything before finding the name card she had given to Linda. She put that away. "You would do this too, right?" Then she happily left. Meanwhile, Quincy visited Linda's phone provider and printed out her call record for Maisie. Maisie took it and saw that Linda had been calling a number rather frequently 2 days before her death. She handed the printout to Nolan and smiled beautifully. "I'm sure my lovely husband will be able to find out to whom the number belongs, right?" Chapter 1303. Nolan chuckled, hugged Maisie by her shoulder, and took the paper. "I can, but..." He leaned in closer. "I want a reward." Maisie looked at Quincy through the corner of her eyes. "Don't look." Quincy quietly looked out the window. "I won't, but you need to make it quick. I need to drive." Maisie kissed Nolan on his lips, which made him flash a big smile, and pulled her back in for a deeper kiss. After a minute, she pulled back with her face fully blushing and cleared her throat. "Quincy, you can drive now." Quincy sighed. He shouldn't have stayed in the car. Nolan picked up the laptop and opened an app while Maisie leaned closer to look, putting her head closer to his body. Seeing how this hairy thing was blocking his eyesight, he helplessly smiled and pressed her head onto his chest. "Don't look too close. It's bad for your eyes." Maisie blinked and looked up at him. "I know, I'm just curious." Nolan rarely used his hacking skills, and it had been a few years since the previous time. Nolan planted a kiss on her forehead. "Colton is probably as good as I am already." Maisie was surprised. "Colton?" She immediately sat up and looked at him. "I didn't know that, Colton. Do you think he's only good at playing the piano?" Nolan tapped her nose. "You don't know your son well enough." Maisie was stunned. Colton was a hacker and had hidden it from her for so many years, the disrespect. Nolan was able to find out quickly, and Maisie looked at the information on the screen. "Who's Maxine Summers?" "This is not a local number." Nolan closed his laptop and looked up. "Quincy, get someone to find out who Maxine Summers from Staslo is." Quincy nodded. "Got it." Maisie looked down and was curious. It wouldn't be that simple. Was Maxine related to Linda's accident? Why would she do something to her? And that mysterious woman Cecile, her eyes made Maisie uncomfortable. It seemed like something that was made to look like a coincidence, and it was hard not to be suspicious. That evening at the Goldman mansion. While they were having dinner, Nolan and Maisie sat across from the children, who were already in high school. The babies had now grown into beautiful teenagers. Colton and Waylon looked more and more like Nolan as they grew older. They thought that Daisy was a good mix of her and Nolan, but other than her eyes, Daisy was pretty much the female version of Nolan, and she was absolutely stunning. "Mom, why are you staring at me?" Daisy looked up, saw her mother staring, and smiled. Maisie felt awkward because her daughter had her personality. She cleared her throat and slowly said, "Daisy, you need to be more ladylike." Daisy stopped smiling and pouted while she chewed on her fork. Colton laughed out loud. "Mom, there's no way that she will be a lady." "No, that doesn't work for her." Daisy glared at him. "Why don't you stuff your face with food?" "I was just saying it as it is. You should be a gentleman too." Colton shrugged and said in a serious tone, "I didn't say that I'm not a gentleman. All you need is for Zeph to be a gentleman." Daisy angrily put down her fork and rolled up her sleeves. "Coleman Goldman, there's no need to bring him into this." Chapter 1304. Was I wrong? Colton was annoyed. "You're going to watch a movie during the weekend. I hope you don't complain about him not treating you like a friend." When Knowles had left her, she had cried to him and said that he never treated her like a friend. "You." Daisy was so angry she could no longer eat, so she got up and stomped upstairs. Colton continued sitting there and finished his food. Maisie looked helpless, so she threw a rib into his bowl. "You should stop teasing her." "I will," Colton lazily replied. "I don't want her not to learn from her past. She can't just keep getting attached to every boy she meets. We don't know if the men have bad intentions." He didn't like Saphir because he could see there was something off about him. His sister couldn't see it. Maisie was surprised. Nolan, who was quiet, couldn't help but laugh. It's great that Colton is trying to protect his sister. Maisie suddenly asked, "Daisy is going to the movies with Saphir?" "Yes, she tried to hide it from me." Colton wouldn't have been so upset if he didn't have to find out from someone else that his sister was going to the movies with some other man. Maisie didn't say anything. The children were in their youth, and it was problematic. It might ruin them if they didn't teach them well enough when they were starting to date. After dinner, Maisie went to Daisy's room and knocked on the door. "Daisy?" After a moment, Daisy opened the door with a towel on her hair. "Mom?" Daisy went to her dresser while Maisie helped her dry her hair. "Are you still angry with your brother?" She pouted. "Why did he have to say that about me?" Maisie picked up her hairdryer and slowly used it on Daisy's hair. "Your brother cares about you a lot even though he teases you." "Cares?" Daisy looked at Maisie through the mirror. "He just bullies me. He doesn't care. Waylon would always spoil her and bring lots of presents back whenever he came home. He didn't argue with her either." Maisie smiled. "You silly girl. Everyone shows that they care differently. Waylon loves you because you're the youngest in the family, and since he can't spend time with the two of you, that is his way of showing his love for you. Colton has always been by your side and watched you grow up. He has a bigger responsibility of taking care of you. Even though he's strict, he would always be there for you whenever you cried." Daisy lowered her head after listening to Maisie. Maisie placed the hairdryer on the table and put her hands on Daisy's shoulder while looking at her through the mirror. "Your brother is upset and worried that you're going to the movies with Saphir without telling him." Daisy pouted. "I'm not just going with him. Lisa is coming along too, and..." She mumbled, "I wasn't trying to hide it from him. I just don't want them to be together. He always picks a fight with Zeph even though Zeph treats me nicely. It makes me feel awkward when Colton does that." Chapter 1305. That was why she didn't tell Colton that she was going to the movies. Since she had promised Saphir, she couldn't just cancel it. Maisie smiled and rubbed her head. "I understand. You just don't want your friends to feel bad, right?" Daisy nodded, and Maisie smiled warmly. "All you need to do is to speak to Colton. Look, if you don't tell him how you feel, you'll be protecting your friends, but hurting your family because he did it out of care. He was upset when you talked back. Daisy thought about it for a long time, and the anger in her heart soon disappeared. She stood up. Mom, I'll go talk to him now. She ran out of the room. Maisie walked out and was startled by Nolan, who was leaning on the wall with his arms crossed. How long have you been there? Not long. He smiled and looked at her. You managed to convince Daisy so quickly. Well, it's because I gave birth to her. Maisie raised her brows. Nolan took a step forward and leaned down to give her a warm kiss on her forehead. Our children are mature because they have a mom who knows them well. He cupped her cheeks. It's a shame that I couldn't be there when you were giving birth to them. Maisie smiled and held his hand. The past is in the past. I'll be happy if you'll be there when I'm old and in bed. Daisy and Colton poked their heads out and saw how lovey-dovey their parents were. The next day, Sadie parked her car in the private rental zone. Maisie got out and looked at the crowd gathered there. She turned to say to Sadie, let's go take a look. Sadie nodded and walked toward the crowd. There was a police cruiser, and the person who made a report immediately walked forward. Officers, finally, this way. He brought them toward the area. The crowd didn't know what had happened, so they were discussing. What happened here? I heard that the landlady died. I saw her going to the market this morning and even greeted her. Who would have known that she would be stabbed to death on her way back? That's so scary. Maisie and Sadie looked at each other. They wanted to take a look at Linda's home, but didn't expect to walk into a murder scene. The police officers walked down with the victim's family, who was crying. The police officers gave their condolences and were going to leave when one of them noticed Maisie. He walked over. Mrs. Goldman, why are you here? Maisie smiled and replied, I'm here to take a look at Linda's home, but I wasn't expecting this to happen. The officer was surprised. Linda Vanderbilt lived here? She nodded. Yes. Linda Vanderbilt? The victim's family member heard the name and walked over. It was the landlady's son. That woman is our tenant and hasn't paid her rent for months. We couldn't get a hold of her. It must be her. She must have killed my mom. The police officer rubbed his temple and calmly explained, Linda passed away a few days ago, so there's no way she did this. The man was startled, but his wife suddenly remembered something. Oh. A woman came to see my mother-in-law about Linda's room yesterday. Chapter 1306. Maisie frowned. What kind of a woman? I'm not sure about it. I was taking care of the kid at that time, so I wasn't looking. I just heard her voice. She said that she's Linda's friend and that she's here to help Linda get her stuff. The wife of the deceased thought for a moment and continued. My mother-in-law received $300 when she came back. She told me that that woman gave her a tip, and my mother-in-law was delighted. Inside the car, Maisie leaned against the back of the seat with her arms crossed in front of her chest and fell in deep thought. Is the woman who came to Linda's house Maxine? If it's her, why did she come to Linda's place? To find or to destroy any evidence? The landlady had been killed today, and Maisie felt that it was too coincidental. It seemed to her that an invisible hand was manipulating everything from the dark. It was as if the mysterious woman named Maxine was trying to destroy all the evidence against her. The the things in the residence, and the landlady who had met her. If she was behind all these incidents, she was nothing but a monster. At that moment, Quincy called her. Maisie answered the call, and Quincy said, Mrs. Goldman, we found something about Maxine. At Black Gold. Maisie came to Nolan's office, and before Quincy could say anything, she flung her purse on the desk and supported her arms on the desk to look at Nolan. Maxine should still be in Bassburg. Nolan lifted his eyelids and nodded. He turned the monitor toward her, and there was complete profile information of a certain woman on the screen. When Maisie saw the woman's photo on the screen, she was stunned. How is this possible? Maisie froze and found it difficult to believe it. This was because Maxine had the same face as Sue, the woman Rowena had burned to death. Nolan had looked into Sue's death certificate. He found that the death certificate had not been made public or even cancelled. This was because after Rowena had killed Sue, she pretended to be her family and claimed her remains. However, instead of going to the police station and deleting Sue's information, she lived on with her identity. However, Rowena had died in the sea. The identity of the dead was supposed to be discarded, be it Rowena or Sue. Therefore, she couldn't understand why this woman named Maxine would appear on Sue's profile. She looked at Nolan in astonishment and asked, "What on earth is going on?" Quincy kept his head low as he replied, "Mr. Goldman and I were shocked. The user of the sim is clearly Maxine, but the information I got from my men in Staslo belongs to Sue. Not only that, but she also graduated from Turner Institute of Art, and her parents' information is exactly the same as Sue's." As Quincy was talking, he rested his chin on his hand and continued. "Could it be that Sue and Maxine are twins?" Maisie rubbed her temple and said, "If they're twins, why did Maxine not show herself when Rowena pretended to be Sue?" Quincy was stumped. Indeed, this was strange. Sue had died in a fire, and Rowena had pretended to be her family to claim her remains. As her twin sister, why did Maxine only show up now? And why had Maxine approached Linda? What was her purpose? Nolan chuckled deeply and shattered the dense atmosphere. Maisie and Quincy looked at him, and he said slowly, "I found a problem that was overlooked at first, and now I finally understand it." "What problem?" Maisie asked. Nolan looked at the profile on the screen and continued. Adrian didn't suspect Rowena when she pretended to be Sue because both of them had the same height. Chapter 1307. Nolan stared at the profile as a glint flashed across his eyes. Maybe the Sue who got burned to death wasn't Adrian's student. Maisie nodded in a trance. Nolan was right. Sue was a bit shorter than Rowena was, so there was no way Adrian wouldn't suspect her when Rowena pretended to be Sue. Even though there was a possibility that Rowena might come up with many excuses and lies, it all made sense now. After all, on the profile, Maxine's height was 5 feet 4 inches, about the same as Rowena's. Perhaps even Rowena did not know about this coincidence. She would have never targeted Sue if she had known that Sue had a twin sister. Quincy scratched his head and said, "This is strange." She knew that Rowena was pretending to be Sue, but instead of exposing her, she allowed her to stay around Adrian as Sue. Why would she do that? Maisie did not say anything in return. Nolan suddenly closed the computer and said, "We will know the reason when we find her." "What are you doing in front of the door?" Suddenly, Sadie's voice erupted outside of the office. Quincy knew that someone was eavesdropping on them. He hastily went out of the office and saw Sadie standing in front of Cecile. Cecile did not appear to be nervous at all. With a smile on her face, she lowered her head to look at the document in her arms and said, "I'm sorry. I'm here to deliver the documents, but I heard that you guys were talking, so I didn't enter." Sadie's face sank. "You were clearly eavesdropping." Cecile was stunned. Then, she smiled. "I was standing in the doorway and happened to be able to hear their conversation. Does this count as me eavesdropping as well?" Maisie and Nolan came out. When Nolan saw the document in her hands, he signaled Quincy to take it. After Quincy took the document, Nolan said flatly, "You can ask the head of your department to deliver the document next time." Cecile nodded. "All right." She gave them a smile and added, "If there's nothing else, I'm leaving first." She turned around and left. Quincy asked, "I'm sure she heard everything. Are we going to let her go away like that?" Nolan returned to his office. "So what if she heard everything?" "It isn't a secret at all." Quincy pouted and looked at Maisie. Maisie crossed her arms in front of her chest and smiled. "Your boss is right." Sadie and Maisie came out of the elevator. When they were about to leave Black Gold, Cecile called them. Standing at the entrance, Maisie turned around to look at Cecile. "Miss Wolfsbane, is there anything I can help you with?" Cecile stopped in front of her and smiled. I'm sorry. I overheard your conversation, so I know you guys were talking about Maxine. Maisie looked at her. You know Maxine? Yes, she replied flatly. There was a coffee shop nearby Black Gold. After the waiter served 2 cups of coffee, Cecile picked up hers and said with a smile on her face. Actually, I'm pretty familiar with Maxine and her sister. Maisie looked at her and asked, how familiar? She lifted her eyelids to look at Maisie and replied calmly, I know everything that happened between them. She took a sip from the coffee and smiled. I know you were once a designer in Luxella, Mrs. Goldman, so you got to know Sue. Poor Sue, she was kind enough to save a woman, but the woman burned her to death. It seems to me that you know a lot about these events, Maisie replied, offering her a smile of her own. The corner of Cecile's lips curled into a smile as she continued. Of course, I know a lot about it. She ran her finger over the cup's rim and added calmly, after all, it's because of her that Maxine could only live as her shadow. Chapter 1308. Shadow? Yeep. Cecile rested her chin on her palm. I'm sure you know what shadow means, right, Mrs. Goldman? It means she can only live under the light of other people. She will forever be that person's accessory. Everyone knows about Sue, but no one knows that Sue has a sister named Maxine. Maxine and Sue were twins. However, her mother preferred Sue over Maxine's childhood. This was because Sue had been the most outstanding child in her mother's eyes. Sue had good grades since she was a kid, but her sister, Maxine, was totally opposite of her. Their mother had kept comparing Maxine to her sister. Whenever their relatives or other guests visited them, their mother would only let Sue come out to receive the guests, and she would lock Maxine up in the room. After all, in her mother's opinion, Maxine was an extra. She was a disgrace to their family. After graduating high school, Maxine had not been accepted into the Turner Institute of Art. Instead, Sue had been accepted into the college of her dreams. Sue had been aware that studying at Turner Institute of Art was her sister's dream, so she gave the opportunity to Maxine. In the end, Maxine entered the Turner Institute of Art with her sister's identity and became Adrian's student. However, things had not gone as smoothly as they had expected. Fearing that her sister would expose herself and their mother's rage, Sue had helped her sister finish her assignments and even attended her examinations. She had not given Maxine a chance to perform at all. With those papers, Sue had become an excellent student in the eyes of those professors, including Adrian, and Maxine was able to enjoy the benefits as well, thanks to Sue. However, for Maxine, they were impressed by Sue's talent, not hers. In the eyes of the teachers and students, they only knew Sue. They did not know her at all. Maisie lowered her head. It seemed to her that Nolan's speculation was correct. Maxine was Adrian's student. It was just that she had been using Sue's identity. However, she wondered why Cecile knew so much about the things between Sue and Maxine. She put her coffee down. Since you know Maxine, that means Maxine is in Bassburg now, right? Cecile laughed. Is she? I'm not so sure about that. Maisie looked at her silently. However, there was still a smile on her face. After a short while, Maisie rose to her feet and said, "Thank you for your story, Miss Wolfsbane. I'll pay for the coffee." Maisie picked up her purse and walked toward the counter. Cecile was still sitting in her seat, sipping on her coffee. She looked at Maisie, and the smile at the corner of her lips slowly disappeared. When Maisie got back into the car, Sadie turned her head around and asked, "What did that woman tell you, miss?" "She told me an interesting story." Maisie looked at the coffee shop through the window. "Ask Quincy to keep an eye on her. She isn't simple." Even if everything she had said was the truth, as the third party, it was really strange that she knew so much about the things between the twin sisters. Not only did she know she was Sue's colleague in Luxella, but she also knew that Sue had been burned to death. If it were Maxine who told her everything, then how did Maxine know that she knew Sue? After all, she and Sue had just been colleagues. Other than in the company, they would seldom talk to each other, so there was no way Sue would tell Maxine about her. Therefore, Cecile must be hiding something about Maxine from her. In the afternoon, Maisie placed her hand on her forehead and looked absent-mindedly at the table. Her phone rang and pulled her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, and it was a call from the police station. Maisie and Cecile came to the police station, and the police officers told them that they had found the abandoned vehicle of the proprietor. Chapter 1309. Maisie asked, where was it abandoned? The police officer put the photo on the table and replied, it's somewhere in the middle of the wilderness. There is nothing left but the metal frame of the car. There was no one in the car, so we do suspect that the accident was an intentional murder. After hitting the victim, the culprit burned the car down to erase the evidence. Maisie pressed her lips thin. What about the recording in the car? Someone took it away, the police officer replied. Maisie fell silent. Without a doubt, it was an intentional murder. Otherwise, they would not need to go through all the effort of destroying the evidence. This has nothing to do with Mr. Donovan and his men, right? We've interrogated them several times. They admitted that they had beaten and threatened the victim before, but they didn't kill her. After Maisie left the office, she stood in the corridor and frowned deeply. If it's intentional murder, then Maxine indeed is the greatest suspect. But why on earth did she design a plan to kill Linda? What is the thing that she's trying to hide? Suddenly, Maisie remembered the poison that Linda had put into her tea. Could it be? She returned to the office and said, Sir, can you do me a favor? The police officer was stunned for a moment before he rose to his feet. Sure. What can I do for you, Mrs. Goldman? She parted her lips and said slowly, Can you fix Linda's phone for me? The police officer was dumbfounded. After a short while, he replied, Yes, we can try to do that. But even if we can repair it, the storage card in it is gone. At Hannigan Incorporated. After they had finished their meeting, Tanner and his assistant walked back into the office. There was a woman waiting for them. She was sitting on the couch with her back facing them as she sipped on a cup of tea. The assistant was shocked to see her, and he walked over to her. How did you get in here? Cecile put the cup down and smiled. I've been waiting for you, Mr. Hannigan. Tanner frowned. He sent his assistant away and walked to the couch to look at the woman. Who are you? Cecile lifted her eyelids and laughed. You don't need to know who I am, Mr. Hannigan. After she finished speaking, she pulled a photo out of her purse and put it on the table. The woman you love dearly is living a good life overseas. Tanner took a seat on the couch and picked up the photo. There was no way he could forget the woman in the photo. Even though her face had changed, he could recognize her instantly. She was none other than Pearl Santiago. When he saw the baby in her arms, his eyes turned bloodshot, and he gripped the photo so hard that it crumpled. Where did you get her photo from? Cecile said, playing with the cup in her hand, I got to know Miss Santiago overseas. She told me that you let her go, because you were upset about what happened in her past. Tanner's face sank, and his heart trembled in his chest. 3 years. It had been 3 years, and he finally could see her smile again. However, that smile did not belong to him. She had a kid that belonged to her and another man. Mr. Hannigan, honestly, I think you shouldn't blame Miss Santiago for that. Cecile leaned forward and looked him in the eye. The person to blame is the one who caused Miss Santiago to lose her virginity, and I'm sure you should know better than me who that person is, Mr. Hannigan. Tanner lifted his head. What do you mean? Cecile sat upright, and a hint of coldness crossed her eyes. If it weren't for Maisie, Miss Santiago wouldn't have ended up in that situation. She may seem like she doesn't hate her on the surface, but I'm sure she still hates her to the core deep down. It's just that Maisie's Mr. Goldman's wife, so she can't do anything to her. Ultimately, she has no choice but to part with the man she loves since she isn't pure anymore. Mr. Hannigan, Miss Santiago told me that she still loves you after all these years, but she can't get over that thing. When Tanner did not say anything, Cecile went closer to him and said, she wanted me to pass you a message. She will only return to your side if Maisie is gone. After that, Cecile left the office without turning her head, leaving Tanner to sit frozen stiff on the couch alone. Chapter 1310. Tanner looked at the crumpled photo and set his jaw tightly. At night, Maisie was doing the financial report in her notebook on the bed. When Nolan came out of the bathroom, he put the towel he used to wipe his hair aside and walked up to her. The bed sank, and a warm body approached her from behind. Before she could do anything, she was enveloped by the fragrance of the body shampoo. "Are you still working, Z?" he asked. She turned over and placed her palm on his chest. "Of course, I'm busy. I have to bring work home." Nolan kissed the center of her eyebrows, before moving on to her lips. She groaned and reached out to hug him. "Nolan." "I'm here," he replied as he deepened the kiss. Maisie opened her lips with difficulty and said, "I don't feel comfortable if we can't find out the relationship between Cecile and Maxine. It seems to me that Maxine is coming for me." He stopped and glanced at her face. Maisie's eyelashes trembled, and she continued, "Linda's death might be related to the person who wanted to poison me. I wasn't dead. Her plan failed, so Linda was killed." Nolan stroked the corner of her lips with his finger, and his breath was heaving. "Has it never crossed your mind that they might be one person, Z?" "One person?" Maisie asked. Nolan sat upright. The desire was slowly gone from his eyes, leaving nothing but coldness behind. "I asked Quincy to keep an eye on her, so I know everything she did in black gold. She was absent from work on the day of Linda's accident." Maisie turned around and sat up. She knew what Nolan was trying to say. Cecile had left the company when Linda ran into the accident. Suddenly, she thought of something and asked, "How about the day before yesterday?" "It's the same," he replied. Maisie pressed her lips thin and lowered her head. The day before yesterday, someone had visited Linda's place. The wife of the landlady's son had said it was a woman, and everything fell into place. Cecile, who had been absent from work when Linda ran into the accident and who had visited Linda's place the day before yesterday, was Maxine. In other words, Maxine had changed her face and her identity, but why did she do that? There was no feud between her and Maxine. Nolan cupped her cheek and went closer to her. "Z, no matter who she is, I'll expose her true form. I don't care about other people, but she should never try to harm my family." He pulled her into his arms, and when Maisie felt how nervous he was, she chuckled and whispered into his ear, "With you by my side, I'm not afraid of anything, Knowles my love." "Really?" Nolan giggled. He kissed her lips and said, "I thought you were going to cry because you're too scared." Maisie turned around and pinned him under her. She untied her belt, and her silk dress fell off her body. "We still don't know who will cry in the end yet." A chuckle escaped from Nolan's lips as he held on to Maisie's waist. "Seems like someone is asking for some punishment." The night was getting darker and darker. The dew turned into a layer of fog on the glass window. The figures reflected in the window were blurry and filled with emotion. The next day, at the police station, the police officer handed the repaired phone to Maisie. Maisie hastily checked the messages as soon as she got the phone, and just as she expected, the messages, when Linda ran into the accident, were still on the phone. Maisie returned the phone to the police officer and said, "Thank you." Suddenly, she thought of something and pulled a document out of her bag. "She might be the one behind the incident, but I haven't figured out her true identity, and we don't have any evidence to prove that she's the culprit yet." The police officer took the document and read through it. He lifted his head and said, "Thank you for your information, Mrs. Goldman. We'll look into this woman's background." When Maisie came out of the police station, she got into her car and drove away. A black car that was parked not far away quickly followed after her. While Maisie was driving, her face sank when she thought about the possibility of Maxine being Cecile. It seemed to her that she had a lot of grudges against Sue and her mother when she told her the story in the coffee shop that day.